Our text for this morning is John chapter 4. That's found on page 1064, or you can follow it in your bulletin. John 4, starting at verse 43 to the end of the chapter, verse 54. Here we have Jesus' second great sign miracle. Verse 43. So 2 days after he, that is Jesus, departed thence and went into Galilee. For Jesus himself had testified that a prophet hath none honor in his own country. Then when he was come into Galilee, the Galileans received him, which had seen all the things that he did at Jerusalem at the feast. For they went also to the feast. Jesus came again into Cana, a town of Galilee, where he had made of water wine. And there was a certain ruler whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus was come out of Judea into Galilee, he went unto him and besought him that he would go down and heal his son, for he was even ready to die. Then said Jesus unto him, Except ye see signs and wonders, ye will not believe. The ruler said unto him, Sir, go down before my son dies. Jesus said unto him, Go thy way, thy son liveth. And the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him, and went his way. And as he was now going down, his servants met him, saying, Thy son liveth. Then inquired he of them the hour when he began to amend. And they said unto him, Yesterday, the 7th hour, the fever left him. Then the father knew that it was the same hour in the which Jesus had said unto him, Thy son liveth. And he believed, and all his household. This second miracle did Jesus again after he was come out of Judea into Galilee. The title of our message this morning, you can follow it in the bulletin if you like, John chapter 4, verses 43 to 54, Jesus' second sign miracle, which is the nobleman's son. Our introduction. The book of John presents us with 8 miracles. Each of these 8 miracles is designed to show us something or be a sign of the kingdom Christ had just come to establish. John does not use the miracles for their own sake when he writes, but uses them as pictures of the spiritual kingdom that Christ has come to create. They're signs. For instance, the first miracle, which was turning water into wine, demonstrated that Christ's kingdom would take the ordinary human and work in them an extraordinary conversion. That was the sign of the first miracle. In this morning's text, we read of the second miracle, the healing of the nobleman's son at Capernaum, which is a sign that Christ's kingdom will be found by faith in the person and word of the Son. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 43 to 45, the dishonored prophet, Jesus, comes to Galilee. Verses 46 to 50, the nobleman's son is healed. And verses 51 to 54, the nobleman's faith is justified. Now our context. The first sign, which we already saw, water into wine, symbolized the nature and blessing of the New Testament kingdom, in which mankind, by conversion, will be changed and made new. Here in the second sign, we learn that faith is essential to the reception of the messianic blessings of conversion. In other words, conversion will only be by faith. Like the narrative with Nicodemus that we looked at in chapter 2, and last 3 weeks, the Samaritan woman at the well, the subject is material, the healing of this boy, but the message is spiritual. In each case, the person wants something, but does not want the most important thing that Jesus is offering, which is faith. Remember, the woman at the well wanted some kind of water that she would never thirst again. And now this guy just wants the healing of his son. But what Christ is telling them is, that's great to want that, but faith is what you should really be wanting. So Jesus naturally uses their wants to show them their need for faith. Jesus uses common substances in all cases, like water with Nicodemus and living water with the Samaritan woman, to speak of the baptism of repentance and the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. Now he will use the healing of the young boy to teach our need for faith. We come to our first point. Verses 43 to 45, the dishonored prophet comes to Galilee. Verse 43. So 2 days after he, which is Jesus, departed thence and went into Galilee. As you remember, about 3 days before this, Jesus had been in Judea during the Passover. After the arrest of John, he and his disciples headed for Galilee. They were interrupted on their way to Galilee by a stop in Samaria, which we've looked at the last 3 weeks, where Jesus converted the woman at the well and many other Samaritans. If Jesus had prolonged his stay and his work in Samaria any longer, he probably would have turned all the Jews against him. And his real work was, or his first work at least, was to be done in Israel. So we're told here that now after a 2-day stay in Samaria, Jesus and his disciples are now in Galilee, which is where they were intended to go. Verse 44, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet hath no honor in his own country. This explains why Jesus went to Cana and not back to his hometown of Nazareth. As Jesus came to Galilee, we're told that he particularly avoided Nazareth, his original home in Galilee. Now, Jesus, we know, was born in Bethlehem, but he spent the majority of his years in Nazareth, and that's why he considers it his hometown. Nazareth had proved itself a city unworthy to receive Jesus. In Nazareth's previous treatment of Jesus, Jesus found the old adage to be true, that a prophet hath no honor in his own country. Therefore, we're told he went to Cana rather than going to Nazareth. The general adage is true, that the people show regard to a man that comes from afar more readily than one who is merely a native like themselves. And I'll try to explain why that's true. The reason a normal prophet, not Jesus, but a normal prophet, has no honor in his own home country is because the townspeople can usually remember them when they're young. They remember that while they were unlearned, they were young, they were unlearned, and maybe even sometimes foolish. It's hard for older people to accept that a person that was once unwise and younger than them has become wiser than them. The sins of youth, of course, are never entirely forgotten on the aged. But this is a difficulty when we come to Jesus as a prophet, because Jesus is different. Jesus had no sins of his youth. Nazareth should have understood better than any other country that he was much more than a prophet, because his youth was a picture of perfection. Yet they could not get over the fact that he was younger and that he was the son of Joseph and Mary. That's all they could see. Therefore, they alienated themselves from him, foolishly. It may have been that Jesus' perfections were an offense to them, preferred sin. They could not fathom that the Son of God could have been a man living among them for almost the past 30 years. Their failures over 3 decades to recognize the perfection of Jesus resulted in Jesus now avoiding them and traveling instead to Cana. Verse 45. Then when he was coming to Galilee, the Galileans received him, which had seen all the things that he did at Jerusalem at the feast, that is Passover. For they went also to the feast, even though they were from Galilee. Jesus here receives an honored welcome at Cana in Galilee, we're told. Now we remember when Jesus first went to Galilee, or Cana, he was an invited guest at a wedding. Now he's a welcome guest. Although the people of Galilee were regularly attendees to the Jerusalem temple and its feast, they were very far from Jerusalem, and therefore they were not as influenced by the Sanhedrin as the people in Judea were. They weren't afraid to acknowledge Christ like the people in Judea were afraid to. The people of Galilee also had friendly relations with the local Gentiles, and they were far less prejudiced by Jewish influence. Yet here the text gives us a more specific reason why Jesus was welcomed in Galilee, while he was unwelcomed in Judea. It says, many in Galilee, we are told, were present at the Passover and had seen all the things that he did at Jerusalem at the feast. They had observed his teachings at the Passover. John does, however, negatively mention that the crowd was chiefly impressed by the miracles of Jesus. And therefore, Jesus will use this next miracle to teach that faith must progress beyond just the sight of seeing miracles. We come to our second point, verses 46 to 50. The nobleman's son is healed. Verse 46. And Jesus came again into Cana, a town of Galilee, where he had made of water wine. And there was a certain ruler whose son was sick at Capernaum. Here we are told that Jesus returned to a specific town in Galilee, namely Cana. This is where John recorded Jesus' first miracle, and here Jesus will also perform his second miracle recorded by John. The first miracle had prepared the ground. This second miracle will build on that ground. News of Jesus' first miracle had no doubt spread, and large crowds had now gathered in Cana. And out of this crowd, we're told, came a certain ruler whose son was sick at Capernaum. As with many of the miracles in the book of John, out of the people comes a nameless, mysterious stranger. First we had a member of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus, that strangely comes at night. Then we have this unnamed Samaritan woman at the well. And now we have an unnamed ruler. And later we'll learn of this unnamed centurion. And then an unnamed maniac. And John doesn't name them. In most of these cases, we have no name except for Nicodemus. We know nothing of their past. Their nameless characters take center stage in the Jesus narrative for a brief moment. They speak with Jesus. Jesus supplies their need more than they even know, and then they disappear. Barely to be heard of again in our text. Strange. No history almost ever precedes them, and no after account of them is almost ever given. It's interesting. Here's what we can deduce about this certain ruler. He's a nobleman, which means he's a king's officer. He might even be of royal blood. It is likely that he was either a civil or a military officer in the court of Herod Antipas. He was likely part of the royalist party, which we call the Jewish Herodians. The Herodians were Jews that were loyal to Herod Antipas, who not only were hated by the Pharisees because they didn't want to accept Roman power, and it offended them that these Jews did want to accept Roman power, but the Herodians were also adversaries of Christ. It was the practice of Herod Antipas to select high-born Jews to serve as officer, to make himself look like he was friendly to the Jews. The Herodians also were mainly situated in Galilee. Now, of course, we can assume that this ruler did not remain a Herodian after this text. We're told that this ruler's son, nobleman, had a fatal fever. The fever was an epidemic called the plague of Capernaum and had brought many to death. Death was always expected. And the ruler feared, of course, that his son would suffer this same fate of death. Verse 47. When he heard that Jesus was come out of Judea into Galilee, he went unto him and besought him that he would go down and heal his son, for he was even ready to die. Let me preface all this with something. This is not about a nobleman's sick son. This is about the faith of the nobleman. That's really what the story's about. The son is just backstory. The father had heard of the arrival of Jesus in Cana, although he was from Capernaum, which was 20 miles away. He knew of the fame that had followed Jesus since his teaching and miracles at Judea, and he had undoubtedly heard of the miracle, water into wine miracle at Cana. Although he is a royal official with servants at his command, still he goes in person to beg of Jesus. It was because of this knowledge and his great anxiety for the life of his son that he walks 20 miles in order to beg Jesus to come and to heal his dying child. It should be noted at this time that this is his own desperate need that drives him to Jesus. It is not his desire to know more about the Messiah. He has not much of a faith. If it were not for his sick son, he probably would not have troubled with Jesus at all. We see that God's providence often puts us in a great need in order to move our faith forward where it belongs. The nobleman had a faith that was hardly conscious yet of its own existence. The ruler had no real interest in Jesus, but then he must have thought to himself, what if, after all, Jesus is the Christ, the long-expected deliverer, and he can heal my child? Why not try? Here John is painting a picture of a man torn between fear and hope. His soul is in conflict, but the Spirit is using the conflict to bring the Father to a living faith. The sickness of the child is what God will use to make the man's faith sincere. It took the fevered body of the son to advance the lazy heart of the father's faith. The father fully acknowledges that all human help has been exhausted and that only a miracle can now save the child's life. The fact that he himself comes with the request shows the desperate state of his faith, but also the humility of his faith that he would come. The fact that he thinks that Jesus must travel back with him to Capernaum and heal his child in person shows the imperfection and the limitation of his faith. Verse 38. Then said Jesus unto him, except ye see signs and wonders, ye will not believe. Guy asks him, Jesus rebukes him. Jesus' answer is stern and rebuking to the request to come heal his child. This the reader does not expect. We assume Jesus will share the reader's anxiety and be kind and helpful, even comfort this worried man. But this is not what the reader hears. Jesus was no doubt frustrated with his many followers who just wanted to see a miracle, just like this man, but had little interest in faith, which was the desired result of these miracles. With this context, Jesus says, my mission is to teach you to believe or have faith in my person, but you just want marvels. Unspiritual men always require outward marvels, they think, before they will believe. They believe that outward proof is needed to force their faith. But Jesus is saying that a faith that is forced or exists only by visual proof is of little to no worth. Jesus might even here be speaking with a little bit of bitterness, for he was just with the Samaritans who had come to believe only the day before, and the Samaritans never asked for a sign or visible proof. It should be understood that this rebuke is not directed only at this man. You have to understand that Jesus here uses the word you or ye in the Greek in the plural tense to extend his rebuke not just to this man but to the whole crowd who wants to see marvels. The man is just like the crowd. He wants marvels instead of faith. The ruler is typical of the whole crowd of those who believed only because of the signs they saw and whose faith had stopped with the signs and whose faith would not advance to understanding that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. Jesus could not be satisfied with such a superficial faith. He's got to teach them a deeper faith. This rebuke might also be directed at the court of Herod. Remember, this nobleman was from the court of Herod, in which this ruler served. The court was characterized by an exaggerated and perverse taste for wonder works, but was entirely unreceptive to the spiritual influence of the works of Christ. We learn later that Herod had wanted to meet Jesus, but only to observe these miracles. Jesus is telling them this, so he'll go back and tell Herod that. This hardness of heart among Herod and the many Jews, which craved wonders, refused to hear or obey the truth of the gospel. Jesus' words rebuke the unreceptive and unreasonable spirit in anyone who will not see his miracles as evidence that he is more than a prophet magician. The people must progress to see that he is the promised Messiah, the second person of the Godhead, the Son of God. The complaint of Jesus is that so many would cease to believe in any manner or would never believe, even as much as they did, unless he furnished them with miracles on which to rest their faith. Therefore, Jesus refuses to hurry to Capernaum and to work the miracle under this condition. You just want to see a marvel? You're not getting one, is what he says. By this refusal, however, Jesus calls for and seeks to awaken a better faith in the heart of this royal official, this nobleman. In the refusal lies a promise to help the man if only he will rise to a truer and a better faith. He's going to test his faith. Jesus does not deny the poor faith of this ruler. He doesn't say that he has no faith, but declares that it is not enough by what he says. He is calling for a better faith. Sometimes Jesus calls for faith, and then he seals it with a miracle. And then sometimes he simply works a miracle in order that faith will follow. He does both. Sometimes he puts one before the other after. Therefore, the miracles of Jesus always aimed at producing faith or increasing faith, but always as signs, not wonders. This statement here was Jesus' first attempt to turn this man's faith to a higher direction. Jesus intends to use this man's superficial faith as a sign to also strengthen the faulty faith that lies within the crowd of the people in Galilee. 49. The ruler answers Jesus' rebuke about you only want to see a wonder. The ruler said unto him, Sir, go down before my son dies. He persists, just like Nicodemus did, just like the Samaritan woman did. He persists. The ruler is undeterred by the small rebuke of Christ, and rightfully so. By the way, he only resists because the Spirit is working. He doesn't resist because the Spirit is working. He does not turn away in sad disappointment, and this is progress. Jesus' word has produced the first tiny advance in this man to real faith. The form of this nobleman's words in the original Greek are, Come down, or my little child will surely die. But we must remember that there are always two things going on at the same time. The literal narrative is about the healing of a young boy, but the spiritual narrative is about the need of this man to progress in the faith. Jesus is using this occasion to teach Galileans who are desirous of wonders that they need to progress in their faith. This nobleman ruler, in other words, is a spiritual infant. It was a human sorrow and the fear of losing his son that would be used by God as the birth pangs of a living faith. His faith was barely alive, like his son, who was barely hanging on to his life. This man does not understand that before him is the Son of God. Jesus is God, and yet this ruler can see him as nothing more than a spiritual magician. The ruler is convinced that Jesus must be present to heal his son because he does not understand who Jesus is. He also believes that once the spirit has left the body of his child, that it can never return. Therefore, he asks Jesus to hurry to Capernaum. Jesus must teach this man that he is so much more than just a creator of wonders. Verse 50. Jesus said unto him, Go thy way, thy son liveth. And the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him and went his way. While Jesus' first words to the ruler carried the tone of rebuke, his second answer displayed encouragement and a healing. Jesus, as was the case with the other Samaritan woman, just as was the case with the Samaritan woman, Jesus had to rebuke the recipient of his grace in order to place their faith in the right light, or to place his miracle in the right light. Jesus tells the ruler, Go thy way, thy son liveth. These words should be taken to mean, be assured. Go home, thy son lives. In other words, it is not at all necessary that I should prolong your suspense and anxiety. Right here and now, Jesus says, I grant your prayer and give you your little son's life. Right now, he's completely healed. In this line, Jesus corrects the man's faulty notion about having to hurry to his child's side. And by the way, he does it with one phrase. The power to heal lies in the person of Jesus. That's what he's teaching him. It is a matter of his will and his word, not how many miles he is from his son. Of course, here Jesus gives beyond what the ruler asks. Jesus' healing power was not confined to time or space. It worked 20 miles away. The ruler wouldn't even have to wait for Jesus to walk the 20 miles to heal his son. He was healed right now. Jesus was tired of doing miracles because the people had only longed for the wonder. So isn't it interesting what Jesus does here? He performs a miracle, but not one that anyone can see. Ironically, the ruler wanted only a miracle. So Jesus gave him a miracle and healed his son. But a miracle he would have to accept by faith and not by sight. He wouldn't see it. He'd have to believe in it with his heart rather than believe in it because he saw it with his eyes. This is why our confession states that faith is the work of Spirit of Christ in the heart. Not in the eyes. In the heart. This man needed to progress beyond a sight faith to a heart faith. We notice that the Spirit does not begin to work in the man's heart. So no visible miracle was needed. We notice that the Spirit does begin to work in the man's heart. So no visible miracle was needed. The man had progressed. He does not believe by sight. But as the text says, the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him. Just the word. Because the Spirit had worked in him. The man by faith takes Jesus' word as a divine pledge, as an unconditional assurance, and as an absolute promise. That was more faith than he had when he showed up. The man heard only one word, because that whole phrase that Jesus speaks is actually just one word in the Greek. But now, look at what this man does. Look how his faith is increased. Resting on one word, he asks no more. He doesn't ask a single follow-up question. He just leaves. And with a better and truer trust than the one he had before he'd shown up. He now believed without visible evidence. His faith was at first inadequate because it clung to the lower evidence, sight alone. It's an evidence, but it's a lower evidence, sight alone. When all the evidence that we need for faith in the word and work is in the person of Jesus. The healing of the nobleman's son was a miracle. But we see here the greater effect was that the ruler's faith progressed, and progressed for the benefit of others. We see that in our third point, verses 51 to 54. The nobleman's faith is justified. 51. And as he was now going down, his servants met him, saying, Thy son liveth. It was now the following day that he reached his home, although he did not have to wait until he actually reached home. It was not an anxious ride as when he had come from Canaan. For by faith he now believed the words that Jesus said, and he could go home without all the anxiety. While this ruler had full assurance, his servants, who of course had not seen the miracle of Jesus, assumed that he must still be in some anxious state. So these very good, by the way, and faithful servants, instead of waiting for him to come home, ride out to meet their master in order to give him the good news about the recovered state of the son. Verse 52. Then inquired he of them the hour when he began to amend, and they said unto him, Yesterday, the 7th hour, the fever left him. The answer of the ruler must have been curious to the servants. The servants must have thought, why is the ruler not jumping for joy at hearing the news that their son